You think you know what you are. You've been told you're a human being, a collection of cells, a biological organism that evolved on a small planet orbiting a medium-sized star in an ordinary spiral galaxy. You understand the rough outline. You know about atoms and DNA and neurons and the brain. You've heard that consciousness is produced by the brain, that thoughts are electrical signals, that you are, in some fundamental sense, a physical thing that obeys physical laws. You think you understand the basics of your own existence. Here's what nobody tells you. Science does not know how you are doing what you are doing right now. Not in the vague sense of we're still working on some details. In the specific, precise, technically rigorous sense that the most important thing happening in this moment, the fact that there is something it is like to be you, right now, hearing these words, feeling whatever you're feeling, being aware that you are here, has no explanation in any physical theory anyone has ever written. Not a partial explanation, not an approximate one, none. The question of how matter became conscious, how the universe went from quarks and electrons and photons to something that can experience being, is not a question that science has mostly answered. It is a question that science has barely started to address. And the reason it hasn't started, the reason the best physicists and neuroscientists and philosophers of mind keep arriving at the same wall, is that the question may require ideas we do not yet have. Frameworks that don't exist. A revolution in our understanding of what reality is that is at least as large as anything Einstein or Darwin or Newton produced. You are the most extraordinary and least understood thing in the observable universe. Not because you're special in some comforting way. Because consciousness, the specific thing that is happening as you listen to this, is genuinely, rigorously, deeply inexplicable by the best theories of reality that human intelligence has so far produced. The universe spent 13.8 billion years doing things we can explain. Building particles and atoms and stars and planets and chemistry and cells and nervous systems, all of that we have accounts for. Incomplete ones, yes, but real accounts. Physical processes that connect to each other, that follow from the laws of physics, that we can model and predict and understand. And then, somewhere along that chain, something happened that none of it explains. The lights came on. Something started to experience. Tonight, we're going to follow that chain, all 13.8 billion years of it, step by step. Because the only way to understand how extraordinary the thing at the end is, the thing you are right now, is to understand what came before it. And understanding what came before it means confronting something that most people never fully let themselves feel. The universe existed, for the vast majority of its history, in total darkness. Not the darkness of no photons, the darkness of a reality that was entirely, completely, absolutely unobserved, in which events happened and stars burned and galaxies collided and supernovae scattered the elements of life across the cosmos. And nothing in any of it knew. For billions of years, the universe was awake but blind, rich with energy and structure and process, and completely without experience. And then, something changed. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space and the great unanswered questions of the cosmos as much as we do here, take a moment to like this video or subscribe to the channel. It helps more curious minds find their way here and keeps this journey going. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before we trace the full 13.8 billion year arc from the Big Bang to consciousness, we need to spend time on the specific question that makes this topic different from every other question in science. Because consciousness is not a hard problem the way building a fusion reactor is hard, or understanding dark energy is hard. Those are hard because we lack the technology, or because the phenomena are remote and difficult to measure. Consciousness is hard in a categorically different way. In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers published a paper that drew a line that nobody in the field has been able to cross since. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And what he named was a distinction that had been lurking in the science for decades, without being precisely articulated. The easy problems of consciousness, Chalmers noted, are the ones that ask how the brain does things. How does the brain integrate information from different sensory streams? How does it direct attention? How does it regulate sleep and waking? How does it generate reports about internal states? How does it discriminate stimuli and respond appropriately? These are called easy not because they are simple. They are phenomenally complex, but because they are tractable in principle. They are questions about function and mechanism. To explain them, you need to identify the physical and computational processes that perform them. This is hard work, but it's the normal business of science. Find the mechanism, explain the function. The hard problem is different. And the difference is this: even if you solved every easy problem, even if you explained exactly how the brain integrates information, how it selects what to attend to, how it produces verbal reports about its own states, how every single computational function it performs is mechanically accomplished, you would still have a question left over. Why is any of it experienced? Why is there something it is like to see the color red, rather than just a brain process that detects and responds to 700 nanometer wavelengths? Why does music feel like something, rather than just being a pressure wave that a biological system processes and responds to? Why is there a feeling of pain rather than just a signal that triggers avoidance behavior? Why, when you close your eyes and think about someone you love, is there something it is like to do that? Something warm and specific and irreducibly yours, rather than just neurons firing in patterns that produce certain behavioral outputs? The explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience is the hard problem. And it is hard not because we lack data, but because it is genuinely unclear what a solution would even look like. Every physical theory we have, including quantum mechanics and general relativity, describes how systems behave. None of them contain an account of why any physical system would have inner experience, why there would be a first-person perspective at all. Think about what this means more carefully. Everything in physics is third person. Third person means observable in principle by anyone, describable from outside the system, measurable with instruments, a voltage across a synapse, a neurotransmitter concentration, a pattern of action potentials propagating across a neural network. These are all third-person facts. Any sufficiently sophisticated instrument pointed at your brain from outside could in principle measure them. Your experience of reading these words is not third person. It is first person. It is accessible in its full phenomenal character. The specific way the words look, the feeling of comprehension or uncertainty, the sense of time passing, only from the inside. No instrument pointed at your brain from outside measures the experience itself. It measures the neural correlates of the experience, the activity that accompanies the experience, not the experience. This is what Chalmers calls the explanatory gap. It is the gap between the third-person account, however complete, and the first-person fact. The gap between here is what the neurons are doing and here is what it is like to be having this experience. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, two of the most serious researchers in consciousness science, not given to dramatic claims, spent decades looking for what they called the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific patterns of brain activity that correspond to conscious experiences. They found correlates, robust, reproducible correlates, patterns of brain activity that reliably occur when specific experiences occur. But a correlate is not an explanation. Knowing which neurons fire when you see red doesn't explain why those neurons firing feels like something. The firing is a third-person physical event. The experience is a first-person fact. The gap between them has a name, the explanatory gap, and it hasn't been bridged. The problem goes even deeper when you ask about the specific quality of experience. Philosophers call these qualities qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee, the smell of rain on warm pavement. These specific, subjective, felt characters of experience. Here is a thought experiment that Chalmers uses, that has become famous in the philosophy of mind. Imagine a creature, call her Mary, who is raised in a black and white room and becomes the world's greatest expert on the neuroscience of color vision. She knows everything there is to know about the physics of wavelengths, the biochemistry of cone cells, the neural pathways of color processing, the functional role of color in behavior and communication. She knows every third-person fact about what happens when a person sees red. One day, she leaves the room and sees a red apple for the first time. Does she learn something new? Most people have the strong intuition that she does, that she learns what red looks like, that this is a fact she didn't have before, despite knowing every physical and functional fact about color vision. The feel of red, its phenomenal character, was not captured by any of the third-person knowledge she had accumulated. If that intuition is correct, and many philosophers think it is, though it is contested, then it implies that phenomenal properties, like the redness of red, are not reducible to physical or functional properties. That consciousness involves facts that are not facts about physical processes, that there is something about experience that escapes any complete third-person account. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, argues the hard problem is an illusion. That consciousness is explained away by an account of cognitive functions. That there is no genuine gap, just a persistent confusion about what we're asking for. He calls this heterophenomenology, the idea that reports about experience should be treated as third-person data about what a cognitive system reports, not as privileged first-person access to an ineffable inner theater. Many neuroscientists find this compelling. Many others find it the least satisfying answer in the history of philosophy, a way of refusing the question rather than answering it, dismissing the mystery rather than solving it. Neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who spent decades co-authoring with Crick and has written extensively on consciousness, describes his reaction to Dennett's dismissal this way. It's like someone asking why the universe exists and being told the question makes no sense. The question may be difficult. It may be poorly formed. But the thing being asked about, the raw existence of experience, is real and present and demanding of explanation. What everyone agrees on is this: we do not have an explanation of consciousness that starts from physical processes and arrives at subjective experience. We have the correlates. We have the functions. We have extraordinary neuroscience that maps the brain in detail that would have seemed miraculous 50 years ago. We do not have the explanation of the thing itself. The hard problem is not a niche academic debate. It is the central unsolved problem in our understanding of what we are. Every question about the meaning of life, the nature of the self, the possibility of life after death, the moral status of animals, the possibility of artificial minds, all of these hinge on what consciousness is and how it relates to physical processes. None of them can be definitively answered until the hard problem is solved. And the hard problem hasn't been solved. This matters for what follows, because when we trace the history of the universe, from the Big Bang to the first experiencing mind, we will follow every step with our best science, until the last step. where the science stops and the deepest question begins. There is a quality to what the universe was before consciousness appeared that is very difficult to hold in the mind. Not just dark in the sense of no light. Not just empty in the sense of no life. Something more specific and more unsettling. For most of its history, the universe processed information without any of that processing being experienced by anything. Stars burned. Supernovae erupted. Galaxies collided. Black holes consumed matter. The cosmic web of dark matter and ordinary matter organized itself into the large-scale structure we observe. All of this happened. Events of staggering violence and beauty and complexity, playing out across billions of years. And nothing witnessed any of it. Witnessing requires a witness, a perspective, a point of view from which events register as events, from which the supernova's light arrives and is received as light by something that experiences receiving it. The universe before consciousness had no such point of view. There was no inside to anything, no perspective, no here and there in the experiential sense. Just physical processes, evolving according to laws, in a space that contained no being, for whom any of it was happening. Sit with this for a moment. Not as an intellectual exercise, as something to actually feel. There was a time, 9 billion years of time, when the Milky Way existed, and in the Milky Way there were stars, and around some of those stars there were planets, and some of those planets were warm and wet and chemically rich. And in all of that, in 9 billion years of stars and planets and solar systems and galactic collisions and supernovae and the slow drift of molecular clouds, there was no inside to any of it. No one watched the Milky Way form. No one experienced the first star ignite. No one felt the warmth of early Earth's young oceans. These things happened with complete physical reality, and none of them were experienced. They were not waiting to be experienced. The concept of experience had not yet entered the universe. This is genuinely one of the strangest facts about reality. We live so thoroughly inside experience. Every moment of our lives is the experience of something, that we have almost no intuition for what it means that the universe was experienceless for most of its history. We can say the words. The intuition slides off. Here is an attempt to approach it. Take everything that has ever mattered to you, every memory, every conversation, every moment of grief or joy, every piece of music that has moved you, every time you felt the sun on your face, or the cold of a winter night, or the specific texture of something in your hands, every moment of love, every moment of terror, every dream, all of the content of your life. Now remove the inside of it. Keep the physical events, keep the neural activity, keep the behavior, but remove the experience. There is no longer anything it is like. The brain processes continue, the behaviors occur, but the inside is gone. The lights are off. What you're imagining, imperfectly, because it is genuinely very hard to imagine, is what reality was like for 9 billion years before the first conscious mind appeared. Everything was happening. Nothing was experienced. This is not a sad fact. It is just a fact. The universe has no obligation to contain observers. It operated perfectly well without them for the overwhelming majority of its history. By the time anything capable of experiencing emerged, the universe was already between 9 and 10 billion years old. If the universe's history were compressed into a single year, consciousness arrived sometime in mid-November, at the earliest. Everything before that, the Big Bang, the formation of the first stars, the construction of galaxies, the death of billions of stellar generations, the enrichment of the cosmos with heavier elements, the formation of the solar system, the first 4 billion years of Earth's history. All of it, in the silent dark. All of it happening, but happening for no one. Understanding this helps understand what consciousness is. It is not a default property of matter. It did not appear because the universe was aiming for it. There is no law of physics that says matter must eventually become conscious, any more than there is a law that says it must eventually form chess pieces. Consciousness appears to be an extraordinarily specific emergent phenomenon that arises in specific kinds of physical systems under specific conditions after an enormous amount of prior development. The chain that leads to you is 13.8 billion years long, and each link in it was improbable. Not individually necessarily. Many of the physical processes are well understood and follow from the laws of physics as expected. But cumulatively, the specific chain of events that produced a universe containing conscious beings appears to require an extraordinary concatenation of conditions. Let's follow that chain. 13.8 billion years ago, something happened that physics can describe backward to within about 10 to the negative 43 seconds of the beginning, and cannot describe before that. The Planck time, 10 to the negative 43 seconds, is the smallest unit of time that has physical meaning in current theories. At scales smaller than this, our physics breaks down. Quantum mechanics and general relativity give different and incompatible answers. We need a theory of quantum gravity, which we do not have, to describe what happened at or before the Planck time. What we can say is that at 10 to the negative 43 seconds, the universe was in a state of extraordinary density and temperature. Not a point. The concept of a point in space loses meaning at these scales. A state of extreme compression from which space itself was expanding. In the first 10 to the negative 32 seconds, a period smaller than any number your intuition can handle, the universe underwent inflation. Exponential expansion driven by the energy of an inflaton field that stretched the universe from something smaller than a proton to something roughly the size of a grapefruit, in 10 to the negative 32 seconds. The rate of this expansion far exceeded the speed of light, not because anything was moving through space faster than light, but because space itself was expanding. When inflation ended, the energy of the inflaton field converted to a hot plasma of particles and antiparticles. This is reheating. The Big Bang, in the sense most people imagine it, the hot, dense initial state of the universe, is technically the period after inflation, when matter and radiation filled an already expanded space. For the next fractions of a second, the universe was a plasma of quarks, gluons, electrons, positrons, neutrinos, and photons, at temperatures of 10 to the 27 degrees Kelvin, a quadrillion times hotter than the core of the sun. Matter and antimatter were being continuously created and destroyed. For every billion pairs of quarks and antiquarks annihilating, there was one additional quark that had no antiquark to annihilate with. That tiny asymmetry, 1 part in a billion, is why matter exists today rather than everything annihilating to pure radiation in the first second. The origin of that asymmetry, why matter and antimatter were not produced in exactly equal amounts, is called the baryogenesis problem. We know it happened. We don't fully understand why. The standard model of particle physics predicts a matter-antimatter asymmetry, but the amount it predicts is insufficient to explain the amount of matter we observe. Something beyond the standard model is required, and we don't know what it is. At about 1 microsecond after the Big Bang, the temperature dropped enough for quarks to combine into protons and neutrons. Hadronization. The individual quarks were now bound together by the strong nuclear force into composite particles. The universe was now a plasma of protons, neutrons, electrons, photons, and neutrinos. Between 3 and 20 minutes after the Big Bang, the period called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, The temperature dropped enough for protons and neutrons to fuse into the first atomic nuclei. Deuterium formed. Helium-4 formed. Lithium formed in small amounts. The universe, after the first 20 minutes, had a composition of roughly 75% hydrogen nuclei, single protons, and 25% helium-4 nuclei by mass, with trace amounts of deuterium, helium-3, and lithium. That's it. The entire periodic table of elements, with all the complexity and richness it enables, did not exist. Carbon didn't exist. Oxygen didn't exist. Iron didn't exist. Everything heavier than lithium was absent from the universe in its first 20 minutes. This is a universe that could not have produced chemistry. Not just because it was too hot and dense, though it was, but because the atoms needed for chemistry, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, the atoms that make biology possible, simply did not exist yet. The universe in its infancy was radically impoverished in the elements of complexity. How those elements eventually appeared is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of science. For 380,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe remained too hot for atoms to exist. This sounds like a long time. It was. 380,000 years of a universe filled with hot plasma, protons, neutrons, and electrons, moving freely too energetically to combine. Photons bouncing endlessly off free electrons, unable to travel more than a tiny distance before being scattered again. The universe was opaque. Then, at about 380,000 years, the temperature dropped to roughly 3,000 degrees Kelvin. And something changed. At this temperature, electrons no longer had enough energy to stay free. The electromagnetic attraction between negatively charged electrons and positively charged protons became strong enough to hold them together. Atoms formed. The moment is called recombination, a slightly misleading name since the electrons were combining with nuclei for the first time, not recombining. And it was not a single moment, but a process spanning tens of thousands of years, during which the plasma gradually transitioned to neutral gas. But the consequence of recombination was immediate and dramatic. When electrons bound to nuclei, they were no longer free to scatter photons. The fog lifted. The universe became transparent. For the first time, light could travel freely across space. The photons that had been trapped in the plasma were suddenly released, streaming in all directions. We still detect them, stretched by 13.8 billion years of cosmic expansion from visible light to microwave wavelengths. They are the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in the universe, a snapshot of what the universe looked like at 380,000 years. What followed recombination is called the cosmic dark ages. For a few 100 million years, the universe was dark. Not the CMB dark. The CMB photons were traveling everywhere, but they were in the infrared and microwave range, invisible to anything that might have existed to see them. There were no stars, no galaxies, just an expanding, cooling gas of hydrogen and helium, clumping slowly under gravity in the density variations seeded by inflation. In this dark age, there was nothing, no light source, no warmth beyond the residual heat of the Big Bang, fading rapidly, no chemistry beyond the simplest atomic interactions, no possibility of biology. The universe was waiting, patient and dark and cold and simple. Somewhere between 100 and 250 million years after the Big Bang, the first stars ignited. The gas clouds that had been collapsing under gravity finally reached densities and temperatures high enough to trigger nuclear fusion. Hydrogen nuclei, pressed together by the crushing weight of the overlying gas, began to fuse. The first nuclear fires lit. These first stars were very different from the Sun. Without the heavier elements that later generations of stars would produce, They formed from pure hydrogen and helium. They were massive, perhaps hundreds of times the mass of the Sun, and hot, burning brilliantly through their fuel at a ferocious rate. Their lives were short by stellar standards, a few million years, compared to the Sun's 10 billion-year lifetime. But their deaths were spectacular. Massive stars end in supernovae, the most violent explosions in the known universe. A star many times the Sun's mass, having exhausted its nuclear fuel and collapsed under its own gravity, bounces back in an explosion that briefly outshines an entire galaxy. In that explosion, temperatures reach levels that drive nuclear reactions impossible in a star's core. Elements heavier than iron, gold, uranium, lead, platinum, are synthesized in the extreme temperatures of the supernova shockwave. The explosion scatters all of this into the surrounding space. This is the origin of every element heavier than lithium in the universe. Not the Big Bang. The Big Bang made only hydrogen, helium, and trace lithium. Everything else, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, silicon, iron, and all the heavier elements, was made in stars and scattered by stellar death. The phrase, "we are stardust," is not poetic metaphor. It is literally, chemically true. The carbon in your DNA was fused in the core of a star. The oxygen you are breathing was made in a massive star that died billions of years before the Sun formed. The iron in your blood was forged in a supernova. The calcium in your bones came from the same process. The phosphorus in your ATP, the molecule your cells use for energy, was synthesized in stellar nucleosynthesis and distributed by stellar death. You are assembled from the wreckage of dead stars. Every atom in your body passed through at least one star before it reached you. The hydrogen, about 60% of your body's atoms, dates to the Big Bang. The rest is stellar. There's a specific star that made a significant fraction of you. Not one star. The elements in a single human body came from many stars, across hundreds of millions or billions of years of stellar history. But there were specific stars, specific nova explosions, and asymptotic giant branch stars and neutron star mergers. Specific astronomical events in specific places at specific times, whose ejecta eventually found their way into the molecular cloud that formed the solar system, that condensed into the Sun and the planets, that became the crust of early Earth, that dissolved into the first oceans, that were assembled by chemistry into the molecules of life, that were assembled by biology into you. You are the product of an unbroken chain of events stretching back 13.8 billion years. Every link in that chain was necessary. The removal of any specific star, any specific supernova, any specific neutron star merger from the chain would have altered the composition of the solar system and potentially prevented you from existing in exactly this form. This is not comforting in the usual sense. It is something stranger. The recognition that your existence is not a product of the universe's indifference. It is a product of its specific, particular, unrepeatable history. You are made of specific stars, specific gust, specific chemistry. No other arrangement of matter in the universe is you. The Sun formed about 4.6 billion years ago from a collapsing molecular cloud, a region of gas and dust in the Milky Way, where the density was high enough that gravity began to dominate. The cloud was seeded with the elements from billions of years of stellar death, hydrogen and helium from the Big Bang, and everything heavier from generations of stars that had lived and died. As the cloud collapsed, most of the mass went to the center, where the Sun formed. The remaining material, about 1% of the total, formed a rotating disk around the nascent star. In this disk, dust grains collided and stuck together. Millimeter-sized particles became centimeter-sized. Centimeter-sized became meter-sized. Meter-sized became kilometer-sized planetesimals. Planetesimals collided and merged into protoplanets. Over tens of millions of years, the protoplanets sorted themselves by composition and orbital mechanics into the solar system we know. The early solar system was violent. Objects of all sizes were hurtling through the disk, colliding, merging, disrupting each other. The late heavy bombardment, approximately 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago, was a period of intense asteroid and comet impacts on the inner planets, including early Earth. It was during this period, or perhaps shortly after, that something extraordinary happened. Earth was struck by a Mars-sized object, now called Theia, in a collision so violent that both bodies were partially vaporized. The ejected material coalesced in orbit to form the Moon. This impact is why Earth has a large, stabilizing moon that keeps its axial tilt relatively constant over geological time, preventing the kind of extreme climatic oscillation that might have made complex life impossible. It is why Earth has a fast rotation that drives the dynamo, producing the magnetic field that protects its surface from solar wind. The Moon is not incidental to life on Earth. It may be essential, and it exists because of a specific collision at a specific time with a specific object. A collision that didn't have to happen. That, if it had not happened, or had happened differently, might have produced a different Earth, one without the conditions that eventually produced you. This is a recurring theme in the history of your existence. Contingency, stacked on contingency. Specific events, each of which was not inevitable, each of which had a different outcome as a real possibility, whose cumulative result is you. 4 billion years ago, Earth's surface was a very different place from the pale blue sphere you know. The atmosphere contained almost no free oxygen. The oxygen in our atmosphere today is a biological product, generated by billions of years of photosynthesis. The early atmosphere was rich in nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. Noxious by our standards, but chemically rich. The oceans existed. Liquid water had been stable on Earth's surface since roughly 4.4 billion years ago, incredibly early given the ongoing bombardment. Water is central to everything that follows. It is the universal solvent, the medium in which chemistry happens at a pace and a complexity that no other common liquid enables. The specific properties of water, its polarity, its ability to form hydrogen bonds, its behavior as a solvent for charged molecules, its liquid range, are so well suited to the chemistry of life that some researchers have suggested water's properties are a constraint that directed the chemistry of life into specific channels from the beginning. In the early oceans, or in shallow hydrothermal pools, or in the porous rock of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, scientists argue about the specific location. The first building blocks of life were synthesizing themselves through ordinary chemistry. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, form readily from the simple molecules available in the early Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey demonstrated this in 1952 by running electrical sparks through a mixture of gases simulating the early atmosphere. They produced a rich mixture of organic compounds, including multiple amino acids, in a week. The prebiotic chemistry that produced the ingredients of life was not miraculous. It was ordinary chemistry in a chemically rich environment. Nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, are harder to synthesize. For decades, their prebiotic synthesis was a major unsolved problem. Recent work has found plausible synthesis routes, particularly for RNA's building blocks, under conditions present on early Earth. The problem remains unsolved in all its detail, but the outlines of a chemistry that could have produced nucleotides from simpler precursors are becoming clearer. The central mystery is the origin of the first molecule that could copy itself. Life in the most minimal definition, requires two things: metabolism, the ability to capture and use energy, and reproduction, the ability to make copies of itself with the possibility of variation. Everything else that makes modern life extraordinarily complex arose, through evolution, from that minimal foundation. The chicken and egg problem of biology is this: modern cells use proteins to copy DNA, but they need DNA to make proteins. Which came first? You can't have a protein without DNA, since proteins are encoded in DNA, and you can't make DNA without protein, since DNA copying requires protein enzymes. The RNA world hypothesis offers the most compelling resolution. RNA, ribonucleic acid, is a close chemical cousin of DNA, but it can do something DNA cannot. It can act as both a carrier of genetic information and as a catalyst for chemical reactions. RNA can copy itself. An RNA molecule that could catalyze the synthesis of copies of itself would have both functions simultaneously. It would be a self-replicating molecule that could evolve. This is the origin of what Darwin called the worn little pond, or its equivalent, a microenvironment in which the first self-replicating RNA molecule appeared, began copying itself, began accumulating variations, and entered the process of Darwinian evolution. How that first self-replicating molecule appeared is the deepest unresolved question in origin of life research. The probability of a specific RNA sequence of sufficient length arising spontaneously is extraordinarily small. The standard response is that the process was not random, that chemical selection, mineral surfaces, wet-dry cycles, and other prebiotically available processes directed the chemistry towards self-replication in a way that made the outcome far more likely than pure random assembly would imply. This is almost certainly true, but the exact details remain unknown. What we know is this: approximately 3.8 to 4.0 billion years ago, life appeared on Earth. We know this from the chemical signatures in ancient rocks, carbon isotope ratios that indicate biological processes, microfossils, molecular biomarkers. Life appeared on Earth remarkably quickly after conditions permitted it, within a few 100 million years of the surface becoming stable enough to support it. Whether that rapid appearance means life is easy to start, or whether it means Earth happened to have a specific, unusual combination of conditions, or whether it means the window for life to appear was short and life just barely made it. We don't know. What we do know is that somewhere in the chemistry of early Earth, the first molecule that could copy itself appeared. And when it did, the history of the universe changed irrevocably. Because evolution began, this step takes 3.5 billion years, which means we need to be selective. The first cells appear in the fossil record roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Prokaryotes, cells without a nucleus, simpler in structure than any cell in your body. Bacteria and archaea. They were extraordinarily successful. They colonized every available environment on Earth: the ocean, the land, hydrothermal vents, ice, acidic hot springs, the deep subsurface rock. They are still extraordinarily successful today. The biomass of bacteria on Earth exceeds the biomass of all other life combined. For the first 2 billion years of life's history, roughly half of Earth's entire lifespan, life was prokaryotic. 2 billion years of bacteria and archaea, diversifying into thousands of metabolic strategies, colonizing every corner of the planet, but never producing a cell with a nucleus. Never producing multicellular organisms, never producing anything we'd recognize as complex life. Then, roughly 2 billion years ago, something happened that may be the most improbable event in the entire history of life on Earth. A bacterium was engulfed by an archaeon. a member of the other domain of prokaryotic life, and instead of being digested, survived. It became a permanent resident, an endosymbiont. That bacterium eventually became the mitochondrion, the power plant of the eukaryotic cell. This is the endosymbiotic theory, proposed by Lynn Margulis and now confirmed by molecular evidence so overwhelming that it is not seriously disputed. Every cell in your body, every single one of your 37 trillion cells, contains descendants of that ancient bacterial endosymbiont. Your mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in your cell's nucleus, because they were once independent organisms. The eukaryotic cell, with its nucleus, its mitochondria, its complex internal architecture, is a chimera, a partnership between two different kinds of life that formed roughly 2 billion years ago and has been inseparable since. Why does this matter? Because eukaryotic cells are energy-rich in a way that prokaryotic cells cannot be. The mitochondria produce ATP at a rate that allows the cell to maintain far more complex machinery, more genes, more proteins, more signaling pathways, more structural complexity. The energy budget of a eukaryotic cell is roughly 10,000 times greater than that of a prokaryote of the same size per gene. That energy budget is what makes complexity possible. Without mitochondria, without the endosymbiotic event 2 billion years ago, complex life may have been impossible. Not just delayed, impossible. The constraints of energy metabolism in prokaryotic cells may represent a hard ceiling on biological complexity. You exist because a bacterium was not digested. Eukaryotes eventually became multicellular. The first multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record around 800 million years ago. But the event that accelerated everything was the Cambrian explosion. Approximately 541 million years ago, the fossil record underwent one of the most dramatic transitions in the history of life. In a geologically brief period, perhaps 10 to 20 million years, which is instantaneous by geological standards, the major animal body plans that persist today appeared almost simultaneously. Before the Cambrian, soft-bodied organisms, mostly simple, few with hard parts. After the Cambrian, eyes, limbs, nervous systems, shells, predators, prey. The full ecological drama of life begins. The cause of the Cambrian explosion is still debated. Rising oxygen levels, new ecological interactions, innovations in the genetic toolkit that regulate development, a crossing of some threshold in animal complexity that triggered a cascade of evolutionary innovation. All of these have been proposed, and all probably contributed. What emerged from the Cambrian included the ancestors of every vertebrate alive today, including you. Small, soft-bodied, jawless fish with a notochord, a stiffening rod that prefigured the spine, were swimming in the Cambrian seas. One of them is your ancestor. Directly, all vertebrates on Earth today descended from that animal. From that small Cambrian fish to you is 541 million years of evolution. Vertebrates developed jaws, fish developed lungs, multiple times. Some fish crawled onto land. Land vertebrates developed amniotic eggs that didn't require water. Some amniotic vertebrates became warm-blooded. Some warm-blooded vertebrates developed large, complex brains relative to their body size. And within the lineage of those large-brained, warm-blooded vertebrates, something was developing that had never appeared before in the history of life on Earth. A brain capable of asking about itself. The human brain is the most complex object known to exist in the universe. Not as hyperbole, as a statement that has not been refuted by the discovery of any other object. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons, nerve cells specialized for electrical signaling, connected by approximately 100 trillion synapses. A synapse is a connection between two neurons, a junction across which chemical signals pass to propagate or inhibit electrical activity. 100 trillion connections. The number of synapses in a single human brain is greater than the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. If you counted one synapse per second, you would need roughly 3 million years to finish counting. The brain completes its synaptic activity, its actual processing, in real time, continuously, every fraction of a second. The brain's physical complexity is extraordinary. Its functional complexity is beyond anything we can currently model. The Blue Brain Project, a Swiss initiative that began in 2005, is attempting to simulate the neural circuitry of the human brain in digital form. As of recent progress, they have succeeded in modeling small cortical columns of a few hundred neurons with reasonable fidelity. The full human brain is 86 billion neurons. The project has not yet modeled a fraction of a percent of the full organ. The brain developed its complexity over millions of years of primate evolution. The last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived approximately 6 million years ago. In the 6 million years since, the human brain roughly tripled in volume. This is fast by evolutionary standards. Almost suspiciously fast. The expansion was driven partly by dietary changes, access to cooked food, access to animal protein, access to omega-3 fatty acids from fish, and partly by the evolutionary pressures of living in large social groups, where the ability to model other minds, remember social relationships, predict social behavior, and communicate complex ideas conferred enormous advantages. The neocortex, the folded outer layer of the brain responsible for higher cognition, language, abstract thought, expanded most dramatically. In humans, it is enormously larger relative to overall brain size than in any other species. Its layered structure processes sensory information, generates motor commands, stores memories, produces language, models other minds, plans for the future, creates and appreciates art, reasons about abstract concepts, and, uniquely, thinks about itself. Every experience you have is produced by this 3-pound structure inside your skull. Every thought, every memory, every emotion, every perception, every dream, every moment of curiosity or boredom, or love or grief, all of it arises from the specific patterns of electrical and chemical activity in your neural tissue. That much neuroscience knows. What it cannot tell you is why. Here is where the chain breaks. We can trace, step by step, the 13.8 billion year history of matter. From the Big Bang, to particles, to atoms, to stars, to heavier elements, to planets, to chemistry, to the first self-replicating molecule, to cells, to complex eukaryotes, to multicellular organisms, to animals, to brains. At each step, we have a physical account, incomplete in places, but real. Mechanisms that connect to each other, processes that follow from physics and chemistry and biology. Each step in the chain produces the next step through understandable causal processes. And then we arrive at the brain-producing experience. And the chain ends. Not because neuroscience has failed. Neuroscience has achieved things that would have seemed miraculous 50 years ago. We can watch the brain in real time as it processes visual information, generates decisions, retrieves memories, recognizes faces. We can stimulate specific neurons and produce specific experiences. We can disrupt specific regions and abolish specific functions. We know more about what the brain does than anyone in history. We do not know why the brain produces experience at all. Here is a specific form of the gap. When you look at a red apple, light of approximately 700 nanometers enters your eye. It strikes photoreceptors in your retina, cone cells that respond to long-wavelength light. Those cells generate electrical signals that travel to the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus. From there, signals reach the primary visual cortex at the back of your head, processed in a cascade of visual areas, eventually reaching regions that associate the color with memories, with language, with emotional responses. All of this is physical. All of it involves specific molecules, specific electrical potentials, specific patterns of activity in specific cells. And yet, at some point in that cascade, there is the redness. Not just the processing of 700 nanometer light, the specific quality of red, the way red looks from the inside, the phenomenal character of the experience, what philosophers call qualia. Where in that physical cascade does the redness appear? Is it in the photoreceptors, in the thalamus, in the primary visual cortex? In the higher association areas, in the integrated global workspace, where information is broadcast to many brain systems simultaneously? Nobody knows, not because we haven't found the right neurons yet, but because the question of why any physical process would be accompanied by the experience of redness, why there would be a felt quality at all, rather than just information processing, is a question that doesn't connect to anything in our physics. Physics describes quantities, energy, momentum, charge, spin, mass. It describes the relationships between these quantities, how they evolve, how they interact, how they produce forces and fields and waves. Nowhere in the physics does a term appear that corresponds to what it is like to experience something. Nowhere in the equations is there a variable for felt quality. The concept doesn't appear in the formalism at all. This might mean that experience is not fundamental, that it emerges from physical processes in a way that we don't yet understand, but will eventually understand, in the same way that thermodynamics emerged from statistical mechanics, or that biology emerged from chemistry. This is the view of most neuroscientists and many philosophers. Or it might mean that physics is incomplete. That experience is a genuine feature of reality that our current physical theories simply don't describe. That the universe contains more than matter and energy, and their interactions, that it also contains, in some fundamental sense, the capacity for experience. This view, called panpsychism in its strongest form, has been defended by serious philosophers, including David Chalmers, and is increasingly discussed in mainstream academic philosophy, though it remains a minority view and has serious problems of its own. Chiefly, if experience is fundamental, how do the experiences of individual neurons add up to your unified experience? Or it might mean something else entirely, something we haven't thought of yet. An entirely new framework that relates physical processes to phenomenal states in a way that makes the connection comprehensible. Something as revolutionary as quantum mechanics was to classical physics, which also seemed to make no sense before the right framework was found. Physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness might be connected to quantum processes in microtubules, protein structures inside neurons. Their orchestrated objective reduction theory proposes that quantum superpositions in these structures, collapsing in specific ways, produce moments of conscious experience. The theory is controversial, and most neuroscientists find it unpersuasive, largely because the brain is warm and wet in ways that normally disrupt quantum coherence very quickly. But it represents a serious attempt to connect consciousness to fundamental physics, rather than treating it as a purely emergent biological phenomenon. What all serious researchers agree on is this: the current standard model of physics and the standard neuroscientific account of brain function do not, between them, contain an explanation of why physical processes are experienced. The question remains open. It is probably the deepest open question in all of science. We left off last time at the hardest question in science. Not the biggest, not the most technically demanding. The hardest, in the specific sense that it is a question that the best minds in neuroscience, philosophy, and physics have been working on for decades and have not answered, not even partially. The question of why the physical processes happening in your brain right now are accompanied by experience. Why there is something it is like to be you. Why the brain doesn't just process information in the dark, silently, without anyone home. We traced the chain. 13.8 billion years of it. From the Big Bang to particles to atoms to stars, to heavier elements to chemistry, to the first self-replicating molecule, to cells to the endosymbiotic event that made complexity possible to the Cambrian. Explosion to vertebrates to the human brain. Every step physically grounded. Every step connected to the step before it by processes we can model and understand. And then the chain arrived at you, at experience itself, at the fact that right now, as you listen to this voice, there is something it is like to be you. And that fact, the most immediate fact of your entire life, has no explanation in any physical theory anyone has ever written. Tonight, we go deeper into why that gap exists, what the leading attempts to close it look like, and what the most honest answer to the question is as of right now. We're going to talk about the specific theories competing to explain consciousness. We're going to talk about what happens when consciousness disappears, under anesthesia, in dreamless sleep, and what that tells us about what it is. We're going to talk about split brain patients who revealed something deeply strange about the unity of the self. We're going to talk about whether a machine could ever genuinely experience anything and how you would know. And we're going to end with the hardest version of the hardest question. Not just how you are conscious, but how you know anyone else is. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space and the great unanswered questions of the cosmos as much as we do here, take a moment to like this video or subscribe to the channel. It helps more curious minds find their way here and keeps this journey going. Now, let's go back in. Since Chalmers named the hard problem in 1995, the field of consciousness science has produced a number of serious, technically rigorous theories that attempt to explain why physical processes in the brain give rise to experience. These are not speculations or philosophical hand-waving. They are detailed, mathematically formalized proposals, each with specific predictions, each with serious researchers behind them, each confronting the hard problem in a specific way. None of them has solved it, but understanding why they fail, what each one gets right, and where each one stops, tells you something important about the shape of the problem. Global workspace theory. The first and oldest of the major theories is global workspace theory, developed by neuroscientist Bernard Baars in the 1980s and substantially elaborated by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux. The core idea is this: consciousness is not a specific brain region or a specific type of computation. It is what happens when information is globally broadcast. The brain contains many specialized processing modules, regions that handle visual input, auditory input, memory retrieval, motor planning, language. These modules normally operate in parallel and independently, each doing its job without sharing information with the others. Most of what the brain does happens this way, unconsciously, in parallel, without any unified awareness. Occasionally, information reaches a threshold that allows it to be broadcast to a wide network of regions simultaneously, what Baars called the global workspace. When that happens, the information becomes available to many systems at once. It can be verbally reported. It can influence memory encoding, It can drive voluntary action. It can be attended to. And this global broadcast, Dehaene argues, is what constitutes conscious awareness. The theory has real predictive power. It correctly predicts that unconscious processing happens faster and more efficiently than conscious processing. Because consciousness involves the overhead of global broadcast. It predicts that the moment of becoming conscious of a stimulus correlates with a sudden ignition of activity across frontoparietal networks, which brain imaging consistently confirms. It makes testable predictions about what brain states should and shouldn't be conscious. But here is where global workspace theory confronts the hard problem and stops. Even if you fully accepted the theory, even if global broadcast is both necessary and sufficient for consciousness, the hard problem remains. Why is global broadcast experienced? Why does information being available to many systems simultaneously feel like anything at all, rather than just being computation that happens in a particular architectural pattern? The theory explains the function perfectly. It does not explain why the function is accompanied by experience. Global workspace theory answers the question, which information is conscious? It does not answer, why is any information experienced? Integrated information theory, the second major theory, is integrated information theory, or IIT, developed by Giulio Tononi starting in the early 2000s, and now one of the most mathematically sophisticated theories of consciousness in existence. It is also, arguably, the most ambitious, because it doesn't just describe what consciousness does, or where it lives in the brain. It claims to define what consciousness is at the most fundamental level. Tononi's starting point is phenomenological. Rather than beginning with neuroscience and asking what the brain does, he begins with the structure of experience itself and asks, what are the most basic features that any conscious experience must have? He identifies two. First, every conscious experience is intrinsically structured. It has specific content. Right now, you are not having a generic experience. You are having a specific one, this sound, this feeling, this moment, with specific qualities distinguishing it from all other possible experiences. The experience of reading these words is different from the experience of hearing music, or feeling cold, or tasting coffee. Experience is not a homogeneous glow. It has content. Second, every conscious experience is unified. The specific combination of qualities you're experiencing right now, the sound of the voice, the weight of the dark, the particular mood you're in, is experienced as a single integrated whole. You don't have a separate experience of each quality and then add them together. You have one unified experience that contains all of them simultaneously. Try to isolate a single quality from your experience right now. You can direct attention to it, but you can't remove it from the context of all the other qualities you're simultaneously aware of. Experience is unified. From these two observations, that experience has specific content and is unified, Tononi derived a mathematical quantity called phi. Phi measures how much integrated information a system produces. Specifically, it measures how much more information the system generates as a whole than the sum of its parts would generate independently. A system where the parts all work together, where the activity of each component informs and is informed by the activity of every other component, generates more information than the parts would generate independently. That excess, that additional information generated by integration, is what phi measures. Tononi's central claim, consciousness is identical to integrated information. A system has exactly as much consciousness as it has phi. No more, no less. A human brain has high phi and rich consciousness. A thermostat has very low phi and virtually no consciousness. A photodiode has essentially zero phi and no consciousness. A grain of sand has essentially zero phi and no consciousness. This claim is radical for two reasons. First, it means consciousness is not uniquely biological. Any physical system with sufficiently high integrated information is conscious. A silicon chip arranged in the right way could, in principle, be conscious. Whether any current computer has significant phi is a question IIT can in principle answer. Antonioni's preliminary analyses suggest that current computers, including very powerful ones, have very low phi because their architecture is fundamentally modular and parallelized, with limited integration between modules. High computational power does not equal high phi. The architecture matters more than the speed. Second, it means consciousness is potentially universal. Any system with non-zero phi has some degree of experience. An electron, interacting with other particles, may have an infinitesimally tiny degree of experience. Not the rich unified experience of a human, something so elementary it barely deserves the name. But something, rather than nothing. This gives IIT a flavor of panpsychism at the micro level, though Tononi himself is careful about this framing. The key point is that experience is a graded quantity correlated with phi, and phi is potentially present in any physical system, with any causal structure. IIT makes specific, testable predictions. It predicts that certain brain regions, particularly the posterior cortex, should be more essential to consciousness than others. This is supported by evidence. Damage to the posterior cortex reliably disrupts conscious experience more than equivalent damage to the frontal lobes. It predicts that stimulating the conscious brain should produce a more complex, less predictable response than stimulating the anesthetized brain. A prediction confirmed by transcranial magnetic stimulation studies, using a measure called the Perturbational Complexity Index. Christoph Koch, who spent decades working alongside Francis Crick on the neural correlates of consciousness and now leads the Allen Institute for Brain Science, has embraced IIT as the most serious current framework for consciousness science. He acknowledges its difficulties but argues that no other theory comes as close to directly addressing the hard problem, rather than simply reframing it. The deepest critique of IIT is philosophical rather than empirical. Many philosophers argue that saying consciousness is integrated information simply relocates the hard problem without solving it. Why is integrated information experienced? Why does high phi feel like something rather than just being a physical quantity the system has? The theory explains the structure of consciousness, why rich experiences are unified and informative. But critics say it doesn't explain the existence of experience at all. Tononi's response is that this critique misunderstands the theory. IIT doesn't claim that integrated information causes consciousness, or correlates with consciousness, or is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. It claims that consciousness and integrated information are the same thing, viewed from two different perspectives: the intrinsic perspective of the system itself, and the extrinsic perspective of an observer measuring it. The experience of redness just is what it's like to be a physical system with a certain structure of information integration, viewed from the inside. There is no additional gap to bridge, because they're the same thing described two ways. Whether this fully addresses the hard problem, or whether it merely asserts that it does, remains the central debate in consciousness philosophy. What is not in debate is that IIT is the most mathematically precise and empirically engaged theory of consciousness that currently exists. Predictive processing, the third major framework, predictive processing, originated with Helmholtz in the 19th century and has been extensively developed by Carl Friston and Andy Clark in recent decades. It proposes that the brain is not a passive receiver of sensory information, but an active prediction machine. In this framework, the brain is constantly generating internal models of the world and predicting what sensory inputs it should be receiving. When predictions match incoming data, nothing special happens. The prediction is confirmed. The model is updated slightly. When predictions fail, when reality surprises the model, prediction errors propagate upward through the hierarchy of brain processing, triggering updating of the model. In this view, what you experience is not the world itself, but the brain's best prediction of the world, filtered through its model. The redness you see when you look at an apple is not the apple. It is the brain's predicted representation of the apple, generated internally and updated by incoming sensory data. Your experience of reality is, in a profound sense, a controlled hallucination, a dream that happens to be anchored to the world by sensory information. Predictive processing has been enormously influential in neuroscience. It explains a remarkable range of phenomena. It explains why your brain fills in the blind spot in your visual field with predicted texture, without you ever noticing the gap. It explains why reading typos in text is so hard. Your brain predicts the correct word and only notices the error if the prediction fails loudly enough. It explains the rubber hand illusion, in which your brain updates its model of your body's location to incorporate a fake hand, because the prediction that "my hand is here" is updated by the sensory evidence. Anil Seth, a neuroscientist at the University of Sussex, has argued that predictive processing dissolves a large part of the hard problem. If experience is the brain's internal model of itself and the world, then consciousness is the model. The redness of red is not a mysterious additional property. It is what the brain's predictive representation of 700 nanometer light looks like from the inside. But again, critics note that this explains the content and structure of experience without explaining why there is experience at all. Why does the predictive model feel like something? Why isn't it just computation in the dark, running silently, without any internal light? The prediction machinery could, in principle, operate without any subjective experience of its outputs. Why doesn't it? The fourth position is not a detailed theory in the technical sense, but a philosophical framework that has gained significant traction among serious researchers in recent years. Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the view that experience, in some minimal form, is a fundamental property of matter. Not that rocks are conscious in the way you are, but that the basic constituents of physical reality have some elementary form of inner experience, the way they have elementary forms of charge, or spin, or mass. When complex systems form, particularly the kinds of information integrating systems represented by nervous systems, these elementary experiences combine into the rich, unified consciousness we know. This sounds like mysticism. In fact, it has a serious philosophical pedigree, defended by thinkers including Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, and more recently, David Chalmers and Philip Goff. The argument for panpsychism has a specific logical structure. Start with the fact that consciousness is real. You cannot coherently deny your own experience. Then note that consciousness is not explained by any purely physical account we have. The hard problem remains open. Then observe that physical science itself does not tell us what physical things are intrinsically, only how they behave. Physics tells us that electrons have charge, but it doesn't tell us what charge is made of, what it's like to be an electron from the inside. If matter has intrinsic properties that physics doesn't describe, and physics, being a theory of relational structure, seems not to describe intrinsic properties, then experience could be one of those intrinsic properties, not added from outside. Fundamental. Philip Goff, a philosopher at Durham University, has argued this position in careful, accessible terms. He doesn't claim that quarks feel pain, or that electrons are happy or sad. He claims that they have some infinitesimally simple form of proto-experience, something so basic that it barely deserves the name. And that when these elementary bits of experience combine in the right architectural patterns, rich conscious experience like yours emerges. The main problem with panpsychism, which even its defenders acknowledge, is the combination problem. If elementary particles have elementary experiences, and you are made of elementary particles, why is your experience unified? Why don't you have 10 to the 28th simultaneous tiny experiences, one for each atom in your body? Instead of one integrated consciousness, how do micro-experiences combine into macro-experience? Nobody has solved the combination problem. Goff and others have proposed frameworks that address it, but none are fully satisfying. The combination problem is, for panpsychism, what the hard problem is for physicalist theories, the place where the explanation stops and the mystery begins. Here is a fact about consciousness that is both ordinary and deeply strange. Every time you go under general anesthesia, you stop existing in the only sense that matters. Not your body. Your body continues, heart beating, cells metabolizing, organs functioning, the machinery of biology running on without interruption. But the experience stops. There is no dream, no sense of time passing, no awareness of anything at all. You are gone, in the most complete sense of the word, and then you return. This is different from dreamless sleep, though superficially similar. In dreamless sleep, EEG recordings show rich, structured brain activity. Regions of the brain continue to communicate. Memory consolidation happens. Something is happening, even if you're not aware of it. Dreamless sleep is in some sense consciousness with the reporting function turned off. The system is running at some level, but the specific kind of integrated activity associated with waking awareness is reduced. Under general anesthesia, the brain looks different, not just quieter, differently organized. The normal patterns of long-range coordination between brain regions, the synchronized activity that seems to correlate with consciousness, fragment. The global workspace, if that theory is correct, goes dark. Integrated information, measured in studies by Tononi's group, drops dramatically. The brain is not just reduced in activity, it is disconnected. But here is the experiential fact that no theory has fully explained. When you go under anesthesia, there is no experience of going under. One moment you are there, and then nothing. Not a slow fade, not a period of increasing dimness, just the cessation of experience, instantaneous from the inside. And when you wake up, there is no experience of having been absent. From your perspective, the moment of going under and the moment of waking are adjacent. No time passed. The universe skipped, from before surgery to after, with nothing in between. The neurologist Antonio Damasio has described this as the strangeness that is hardest to explain. Not that you lose consciousness under anesthesia, but that you have no experience of losing it. You cannot observe the moment when experience stops, because observing requires experience, and the moment experience stops, there is no observer. The observer and the observed are the same thing. You cannot watch yourself go dark. This has profound implications for TIN the 1960s. Neurosurgeon Joseph Bogan and neurologist Roger Sperry began performing a procedure called corpus callosotomy on patients with severe drug-resistant epilepsy. The corpus callosum is the thick bundle of roughly 200 to 250 million nerve fibers connecting the brain's left and right hemispheres. It is the primary communication bridge between the two halves of the brain, the channel through which the left hemisphere knows what the right hand is doing, and through which the right hemisphere knows what the left eye is seeing. Severing it stopped epileptic seizures from spreading from one hemisphere to the other. It also created two separate minds inside a single skull. The results that Sperry and his student, Michael Gazzaniga, revealed over years of careful study are among the most extraordinary findings in the history of neuroscience. When the corpus callosum is severed, the left and right hemispheres operate independently. Each half of the brain controls the opposite side of the body and receives sensory input from the opposite side. The right hand is controlled by the left hemisphere. The left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. What you see in the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. What you see in the left visual field goes to the right hemisphere. In a normal brain, the corpus callosum transfers information between hemispheres continuously, so that both sides always know what the other is processing. The brain feels unified because the two halves are in constant communication. Sever the corpus callosum, and they go dark to each other. Each one processes its own information, controls its own half of the body, and is completely unaware of what the other hemisphere knows. The experiments that revealed this are ingenious and haunting in equal measure. A split-brain patient sits in front of a screen. The screen is divided so that images can be flashed briefly to either the left or right visual field, processed by the right or left hemisphere respectively, with no time for the patient to move their eyes and transfer the information across. Flash an image to the left visual field. It goes to the right hemisphere, which in most people is not the language-dominant hemisphere. Ask the patient what they saw. Nothing. The language centers are in the left hemisphere, which didn't see the image. The patient sincerely reports seeing nothing. They are not lying. The hemisphere that controls speech genuinely has no information about the image. But now ask the patient to use their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, which does know about the image, to pick out the matching object from a selection hidden behind a screen. The left hand reaches in and selects the correct object without hesitation. One side of the brain knows something. The other side, the verbal reporting side, sincerely denies knowing it. Ask the patient why their left hand picked that object. I don't know. It just did. The left hemisphere confabulates. It produces a plausible explanation for behavior that it genuinely did not cause and does not understand. It makes up a story to account for actions it observed rather than initiated. This confabulation finding is one of Gazzaniga's most important contributions. He found, across years of testing split-brain patients, that the left hemisphere is an inveterate storyteller. When it observes behavior, including behavior caused by the right hemisphere, by post-hypnotic suggestion, or by direct brain stimulation, it immediately generates a coherent causal narrative to explain it, even when the narrative is completely fabricated, even when the real cause is something the left hemisphere has no access to. Gazzaniga called the storytelling function of the left hemisphere the interpreter, a system whose job is not to accurately report causal history, but to construct a coherent narrative of the self's behavior. The interpreter is always active, always generating explanations, always producing the sense that there is a unified self with intentions that cause actions. Even when the unity is an illusion and the causation is a post hoc narrative. This is not just a curiosity about split-brain patients. Gazzaniga and others have argued that the interpreter is active in all of us, that the sense of having a unified self who makes deliberate decisions is in large part a narrative constructed after the fact by brain systems that rationalize rather than report. The left hemisphere's interpreter is why you always have a reason for what you do, even when the real reason is something you have no conscious access to. The two hemispheres in split-brain patients can disagree. They can have different preferences, different beliefs, different emotional responses. In cases of what's called alien hand syndrome, which can occur in split-brain patients, And in people with certain other neurological conditions, one hand literally opposes the other. The right hand works to button a shirt. The left hand, controlled by the hemisphere that has different preferences about the situation, works to unbutton it. The patient watches this happen as if observing two separate agents in conflict, both using the same body. What does this mean for consciousness? At minimum, the split brain findings show that the unified self you experience, the single continuous subject with one perspective, one stream of awareness, requires active neural integration to produce. It is not built into the structure of the brain from the start. It is produced, moment by moment, by the corpus callosum linking the two hemispheres into a coordinated processing system. Remove that coordination, and you potentially have two separate experiencing subjects in the same skull. Whether split-brain patients have two consciousnesses, or one is one of the most contested questions in consciousness philosophy. The patients themselves report feeling normal, unified, a single person. But they would report this. The hemisphere making the report is the one with language, and that hemisphere is unified within itself. The other hemisphere, which cannot report, might be a separate experiencer. We have no way to know from outside. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, writing about the split brain cases in his famous 1979 essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, suggested that split brain patients might be genuinely in a position to demonstrate that the physical basis of consciousness is not always unified, and that the boundaries of consciousness cannot simply be traced by the boundaries of a person. What he was pointing at is exactly the conclusion Gazzaniga's research supports. The self is not a given. It is produced. The unified subject of your experience, the thing you think of when you think I, is a construction of neural integration that is, in principle, interruptible. Sever the right connections and the self divides. The experience might divide with it into two subjects that share a body without sharing an awareness. The self is the brain's best guess about what a unified agent would be like, and like all guesses, it can be wrong. He questioned of what consciousness is, and when it exists. Think about what it means that experience stops completely, not dims, not becomes vague, but stops, and then returns. If there is a continuous soul, a continuous experiencer that persists through the body's processes, the anesthesia gap represents a genuine problem. Something persisted. The body, the brain structure, the encoded memories, but the experience did not. Whether the experiencer persisted through the gap, or whether the experiencer that woke up is a successor rather than the same being, is a question that cannot be answered by any physical measurement. The philosopher Derek Parfit argued throughout his career that questions of personal identity across time, whether you are the same person as the one who went to sleep last night, whether the person who wakes from anesthesia is really you, do not have deep metaphysical answers. They are questions about which patterns of physical and psychological continuity we choose, by convention, to call the same person. The pattern that persists through anesthesia is strong enough. Same brain structure, same memories, same personality, that we conventionally call the waking person, the same person as the one who went under. But the experiential continuity is genuinely broken. Parfit found this insight liberating rather than terrifying. If there is no deep metaphysical fact about whether you survive gaps in consciousness, if personal identity over time is a matter of degree rather than a binary, then the fear of death, which is fear of the permanent gap in experience, rests on a false assumption about the nature of the self. You already survive small versions of this gap every night. The anesthesia gap is larger, but in kind rather than merely in degree. Whether you find this comforting or disturbing, probably says something about your prior assumptions about the self. What the anesthesia facts tell consciousness science is unambiguous. Consciousness is a physical process that can be interrupted, and when it is interrupted, experience genuinely stops. It is not suppressed, not dimmed, not rerouted. It stops. The light goes out, and when the physical process restarts, experience returns, not as a continuation of something that was waiting, but as a fresh occurrence of the same kind of thing. Every night, you do a small version of this. Every morning, the universe wakes up in your specific form for what is, in a meaningful sense, the first time again. Let's step back from the specific theories and sit with what we actually know and what we don't. You exist. You are having an experience. Right now, in this specific moment, there is something it is like to be you. The quality of the air, the specific weight of this moment, the sound of this voice moving through whatever quiet surrounds you, whatever you're feeling, calm, tired, curious, something else entirely, all of it present, all of it real. And you are made of atoms, not poetically, literally. Every part of you, every neuron, every synapse, every molecule of neurotransmitter crossing a synaptic cleft, every ion moving through a membrane, is atoms. The same kind of atoms that make up rock and gas and plasma and the cores of stars. The same matter that has been doing other things for most of 13.8 billion years. And somehow, in this specific arrangement, the matter experiences being itself. The 13.8 billion year chain we traced in part 1. From the Big Bang to the first atoms, to the first stars, to the heavier elements, to the solar system, to the first life, to eukaryotic cells, to multicellular animals, to nervous systems, to the human brain, leads here, to this moment. To you having an experience that no physical theory we have fully explains. The gap between the last step of the physical chain and the experience you're having right now is the hardest problem in science. Not because the answer is impossible, because we don't yet have the conceptual tools to approach it. The hard problem may require ideas we don't have, frameworks that don't exist. A revolution in our understanding of what matter is. Not just what it does, but what it is intrinsically. That might come in a generation, or might take a century, or might never come. What the science does tell us is certain and extraordinary. The universe spent 13.8 billion years in the dark. Not the dark of no photons. The universe was full of photons. The dark of no witnesses. Processes occurring, structures forming, stars burning and dying, matter organizing and reorganizing over cosmic timescales, and none of it experienced, none of it inside anything. All of it happening, but happening for no one. Then the matter organized itself in a specific, improbable way. A brain, a network of neurons that somehow crossed a threshold. We don't know where that threshold is. We don't know exactly what it requires. We don't know why crossing it produces experience rather than just more processing. And the universe woke up. Not everywhere, not inevitably. In at least one location, on at least one planet, in at least one galaxy, in at least this moment of cosmic history. Here, in you. Right now, and you are lying here in the quiet, aware that you exist, aware of the air and the dark and the sound and the weight of this strange fact about your existence. The universe is looking at itself through your eyes. That is not metaphor. That is as literal a statement as science can make about what is happening as you read these words. You are made of the universe's own matter. You are organized by the universe's own processes. You are shaped by the universe's own history. Every step of it, 13.8 billion years of it, culminating in the specific configuration of atoms that is you. And that configuration is experiencing. Whether it is experiencing because of integrated information, or global workspace, or predictive processing, or some property of matter we have not yet named. We do not know. What we know is that it is happening. That experience is real. That you are the universe's improbable, unexplained, extraordinary achievement of being aware of itself. That is the most remarkable thing in the known cosmos. Not the most powerful, not the most enduring, not the largest or the oldest or the most energetic, the most remarkable, because power and size and age happen everywhere, silently, without witness. You witness. In a universe that spent almost all of its history containing no witnesses, that is something that defies easy description. It defies, in the most literal scientific sense, any complete explanation. And yet here it is. Here you are, real, present, experiencing. The universe woke up, and it woke up in you. Right now, tonight. Sleep well. Good night.